often mistaken for its predecessor, as well as an admittedly identical current production model, the Alco FPA-2, as a relatively unknown locomotive in the American Locomotive Company, or Alco's, production catalog history, chiefly because of its similarities to its predecessor and its similarities to other Alco products being produced at that time. Despite the rise and success of diesel-propelled construction equipment in the 1920s, the dieselization of American railroads was a very slow process. Many factors had a hand in this, including the fact that diesel technology was still not considered reliable enough for such a job, even though it had proven itself worthy by the point of the mid to late 1920s, as diesel-propelled heavy equipment proved to be much more efficient and therefore less costly to operate than steam-propelled heavy equipment, such as cranes, bucket loaders, etc. All this said, and unfortunately for the railroad, so much like any slow-moving condiment like ketchup, molasses, etc., the railroads procrastinated and would continue to do so for quite some time, with one of the few exceptions being the small box cab / industrial switcher class of locomotives designed specifically to get the steam as well as smoke out of tight inner-city areas. But other very specific local factors did affect specific railroads' decisions to get in or out of diesel locomotive operations, such as coal-hauling railroads like the Lehigh Valley, which essentially had a free supply of coal on their lines to supply their locomotives. There was also the simple fact that the people who were running the American railroads at that time were getting older for the most part, sticking to the previous era's conventions, which had in fact served these railroads well, but were beginning to look more and more outdated as the 20s ended and the Depression began in the 1930s in America. The financial chokehold that was the Depression finally convinced many railroads to start adapting new styles of operations, such as utilizing diesel locomotives, most notably the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's new president, Ralph Budd, who came to the conclusion that diesel-propelled equipment, specifically that of his passenger trains, would help to bring down the massive amount of red ink the company was laying out on providing its government-mandated passenger service. The utilization of diesel engines or prime movers in this equipment, plus new innovative compact as well as lightweight designs, would revitalize the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy's passenger service, providing its passengers with a much more comfortable experience that the railroad could provide for less money and less overhead, thus making it notably more profitable and popular, all at the same time. The Depression would in fact start to spearhead many companies getting into diesel locomotive operations. Unfortunately, times they were changing yet again, and not for the better, as World War II would engulf the United States with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Due to the need for specific technology for World War II, specifically that of the diesel engines and their supporting technologies, most of the railroads at this time, with a few exceptions, were forced to essentially acquire more steam engines to help support the war effort. This, however, would change with the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, there was a pent-up demand for new diesel locomotives, caused mainly because of how worn out the steam equipment was from the war effort, aggravated by the fact that even a good-condition steam locomotive still required a huge amount of maintenance to keep it running reliably, resulting in a lot of labor being required, which would now become increasingly expensive as the war came to a close. And thus, diesel locomotive production began to go into overdrive very rapidly as soon as all the major manufacturers were given the go-ahead to resume production. At the time, the old conventions were still being held to in terms of diesel locomotives, much like steam locomotives. One would be produced for switching, and one would be produced for road duties. This is despite the fact that Alco, or the American Locomotive Company, had already come out with its Alco RS-1 that was capable of doing both jobs. But still, this traditional mindset held strong, and many railroads wanted to have full-on road locomotives to handle road tasks. And so many manufacturers produced bespoke road locomotives for road tasks, with a subcategory for passenger road locomotives. As time went on, however, it became very clear that the diesel road locomotive wasn't as practical as it first appeared for these tasks. Specifically that of the diesel passenger locomotives at the time, such as Alco's previously introduced Alco DL109, propelled by two 539 prime movers, or 538s depending upon the era in which it was constructed, and EMD's own dual prime mover passenger locomotive referred to as the E series. The simple fact was, these massive six-axle behemoths with their dual prime mover setups A. consumed far too much fuel to be practical in these tasks, and B. were simply too heavy for the lines they were traveling on, requiring railroads to consider having to rebuild part of their main lines just to accommodate these massive behemoths. Needless to say, not a practical decision or even possible, specifically for those companies that weren't in good financial positions at that time. But even bigger railroads like the Santa Fe began to see the huge difference in fuel consumption for running these massive behemoths, and how much more expensive they were as compared to much smaller models. EMD already had a simple solution. In fact, the Santa Fe had already employed it. EMD's noticeably shorter four-axle freight locomotives, referred to simply as the F series, specifically that of the EMD F2 and F3 models, which were available just after World War II. The Santa Fe found it could utilize one of these particular types of locomotives, usually backed up with a steam-equipped B unit, to haul a passenger train with far less cost than one of the massive monsters, such as the E-series locomotives, making its passenger service more profitable in a period where it needed to be, as expenses continued to climb for the railroads. EMD would eventually respond by simply modifying its F-series of locomotives to accommodate a steam generator in its standard body units. However, the standard length of a standard edition F unit limited the size of the steam boilers and water reservoirs alike, making these locomotives less practical for long cross-country runs, for example, as these locomotives would lack the capacity for not just fuel but water for the steam boilers, necessitating more en route intermediate stops. EMD would work to rectify these issues, and eventually introduce a whole new model that was bespoke for passenger service, referred to as an FP, starting with the FP-7, which extended the frame to accommodate a much larger steam boiler and steam generator assembly, allowing for this engine to be a full-on passenger unit with just 4 instead of 6 axles, weighing notably less, and utilizing just one prime mover instead of 2. It should also be noted that by this point in 1949, when the FP-7 was introduced, the horsepower output of prime movers was increasing drastically, and so a single prime mover could do the work of 2 with less fuel consumption and less maintenance. And of course, not to mention less weight, as well as less length needed to store these locomotives. Alco, seeing this new trend, decided to throw its own hat into the ring, which provenly wouldn't be that difficult. Alco had the perfect locomotive for the job, its Alco FA, which it had introduced in 1946, and was by this point in the late 40s already looking like it needed a refresh, with the horsepower wars heating up. These were essentially Alco's answer to the EMD F units, which were EMD's freight locomotives at the time, which it would essentially give the same treatment EMD had given its F units to make a bespoke passenger unit out of the initial freight-only locomotive. To accomplish this, the locomotive was lengthened. While a standard Alco FA-1 measured 51 feet 6 inches, its new variation of this particular locomotive would be increased to 53 feet 6 inches. Again, much like EMD, lengthening the frame and body of the locomotive to provide room for a steam generator. The extra length can easily be seen beyond the end of the radiator shutters. This is also where the steam generator would be installed. Then, all Alco had to do was simply dig into its parts bin and equip the locomotive with the new 12-cylinder 244C, cranking out a full 1,600 horsepower, 100 more than the original 12-cylinder 244, the FA-1 as it would be known as, was equipped with, as well as the associated electronics, which were again provided by GE, and it had a new locomotive model. This new locomotive model would be logically referred to as the Alco FA-2, or FA-2 for short. Alco would then essentially retro-rename, if you will, all of its first-generation Alco FAs to FA-1s, so it could distinguish between the two models. Needless to say, the before-mentioned changes made it very easy to modify this locomotive for the said passenger service. This is of course done deliberately on Alco's part so it could easily fill orders for either variant of this particular locomotive. To do so, all Alco had to do was install a steam generator in the space provided, as well as regear the locomotive for passenger service, aka high speed, allowing for 100 miles per hour plus top speeds for these locomotives' operations. And thus the FPA-2 was born, F standing for freight, P standing for passenger just to make things more confusing, and -2 indicating the second generation of this particular class of locomotive. Alco would also, as it did before, provide a booster unit available for this particular locomotive called the FPB-2, which is also available as an FB-2 for its standard line of Alco FA-2s. While many would probably confuse this locomotive for its successor, the FPA-4, which is a Canadian-only model built by MLW, there are noticeable differences. Most notable of these differences on the FPA-4s is a second row of vents that run below the standard radiator vents at the back of the locomotive. While the majority of FPA-2s would be built in the US, they would not be a big seller. One of the few companies to invest in these locomotives was the Baltimore and Ohio. As mentioned before, like many of the other railroads at the time, they were slow to adapt to diesel technology. But slowly but surely, as expenses climbed and their profit margins shrank, the company was pushed into doing so. Still ever more uncomfortable investing in diesel locomotives, the company decided to not put all of its chips on one number, if you will, and make smaller orders from different manufacturers to see which was superior. One of these being, you guessed it, for Alco FPA-2s, 10 of them to be precise, and 5 Alco FPB-2s. The FPA and PB-2s were not big sellers, with orders averaging less than 10 units per railway company that actually purchased this locomotive. This may have been a result of EMD getting its production lines back up to full speed since retooling from World War II production, and thus being able to ship hundreds of locomotives in the time that would take Alco to ship 10 locomotives, for example. There was also the sad and unfortunate fact that passenger service in the US was already on the decline, and the demand for passenger locomotives was dropping off. Then there was, of course, the elephant in the room, the Alco 244, with its infamous reputation. Admittedly, these locomotives had the more refined 244C, which was less trouble-prone than its predecessor, but still known for being a headache for Alco to keep running, and costing the company a lot in terms of warranty repairs, having to send many on-site technicians out to repair these locomotives, or even in some cases bring the locomotive back to the factory to have the prime mover completely replaced, especially if the railroads practiced maintenance to the letter, not the spirit of requirements that Alco had put forth for maintenance on these locomotives to the railroads purchasing them. Canadian National was so heavily dissatisfied with the performance, not to mention reliability of these locomotives, it would be forced into taking drastic actions. More on this later. Railroads purchasing the Alco FPA and FPB-2s included the Missouri Pacific, or MOPEC for short, with 19 FPA-2s and 6 FPB-2s. The Alco-centric Great Northern Railroad ordered 2 FPA-2s. The Lehigh Valley ordered 2 Alco FPA-2s and 2 Alco FPB-2s. And the Louisville and Nashville would order 5 FPA-2s. In addition to the US-built locomotives by Alco in Schenectady, New York, a sizable amount of the FPA-2's production was built north of the border in Canada. The biggest order, however, did not go to Canadian railroads, but in fact to the National Railways of Mexico, for 18 Alco FPA-2s and 10 Alco FPB-2s. This was essentially Alco taking advantage of Canada's more accommodating export policies. Canada would, however, come in second place, with Canadian National ordering 6 FPA-2s and 6 FPB-2s, and Canadian Pacific ordering 7 FPA-2s and 2 FPB-2s. Despite the limited production run of these particular locomotives and the underlying reliability issues, there are still a few of them around in museums. Most notably, there is one in the United States owned by the New York and Lake Erie, although it should be noted that their FPA-2 has actually been rebuilt by NY&LE in the past to FPA-4 standards. This locomotive and a few of its sisters were sent back to NY&LE to be rebuilt to FPA-4 standards, having their original 244 prime movers swapped out for 251 prime movers, and having the needed modifications made to accommodate the new prime movers. This was to improve the power output, not to mention reliability, of the Alco 244 equipped FPA-2s. Both of these issues became notable sticking points as the Alco FPA-2s aged for Canadian National. The 244, of course, being replaced with an Alco 251 prime mover, cranking out 1800 horsepower, as opposed to the trouble-prone 244's output of only 1600 horsepower. While the Alco FPA-2 may not have been considered a complete success for Alco, to put it mildly, some of these models continue to exist to this day, delighting rail fans to this day. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like and subscribe. And as always, keep the metal side down.